group design or pitting two or more theories against each other, where they would have disparate expectations and seeing which one prevails. And then there's theory building, which is more of a kind of a basic science application. And when I say basic science here, I'm not just talking about bench science or wet labs, academic, psychological researchers who are conducting small RCTs with Psychology 101 students, I would consider to be basic science if they're doing theory testing and theory building. But my focus today is on application and testing. So and as a theme for today, there's a whole lot of bouncing around that I have to do to get all of the moving parts together. So before we move on, I want to introduce, if you don't know already, this kind of conceptual decomposition of generic effect types. I think this probably came out of the psychotherapy research field. So specific effects are the effects of, say, an intervention that are postulated by a theory. So if you're going to attribute the effect of an intervention to a theory, then, or the particular effects to a theory, those are referred to as specific effects. And when you're talking about this, what I mean is you've got a theory on, let's say, some kind of behavioral health theory, and you're interested in a specific outcome. And so the theory is going to inform what might instill change in that outcome. And so we're talking about theoretical mechanisms here acting upon a specific outcome. There's also in behavioral interventions going to be what are known as non-specific effects. And these might be things like you might have a theory that informs your intervention, but there's all these other contextual factors like maybe the intervention is delivered in a group setting and there's a kind of a positive, warm vibe there that's supportive, and people are making it a pleasant experience. Those kinds of things are not necessarily theoretically described, but may have an impact. So the non-specific versus specific really has to do with whether the theory delineates a certain mechanism versus does not. Common effects are really a subset of non-specific effects. And those are, so if you have an intervention and a control group, in some cases you might expect that some of the non-specific effects are common across the intervention and control group. So in a drug trial, if you have a placebo control, there's going to be expectancy effects for both the compound, the experimental compound, and placebo. So those would be common effects. And then total effects is a combination of specific and non-specific. In most designs, you can't directly estimate specific and non-specific effects unless you're going to impose some untestable assumptions. And really, I do want to point out that if you take a unified theory perspective, non-specific effects are shortcomings of your theory. In other words, your theory is too narrow to incorporate all of the important facets that might affect the outcome of interest. And just as an aside, common effects are usually called common factors, which I think is a mistake, and I think has led to some confusion. What I call common effects are a subset of non-specific effects, so clearly they are effects. And there's a difference between factors and effects, because common factors don't necessarily have common effects. So next I want to make a distinction between tested theory versus testing a theory-informed intervention. If you're testing a theory, your design should really be able to definitively estimate the effects of the kind of the mechanisms of the theory. And that's really specific effects. So you really are after specific effects, which means you need to design an RCT that's going to directly estimate specific effects. So experimenting, comparing an experimental drug versus a placebo is an example of this. And both the drug and the placebo have expectancy effects, but only the experimental drug has a theoretical effect due to its composition. Then that's an example of getting at a specific effect. In my mind, theory testing is in the realm of basic science. Testing a theory-informed intervention is different. It's applied science. I think that an RCT in this realm should be designed to estimate total effects, not specific effects. And as far as I can tell, efficacy, effectiveness, and implementation RCTs focus on total effects. Now there's some blurring that happens in the scientific community. That there's a lot of attempts out there to estimate specific effects in the context of efficacy, effectiveness, and implementation science. I think it's wrong. I think it's because people aren't being deliberate and clear enough in their thinking about what the goals of the research are. So an example here is that, maybe there was a drug trial that happened previously, a drug is approved, it goes into, it's commonly used and prescribed after years. Providers find that it works really well, has no side effects, and so the provider gives the prescription to the patient with confidence. And then all of a sudden you have the effect of the drug itself, plus the effect of contextual factors that the doctor is providing with their relationship with the patient that actually improves the effectiveness of the treatment regimen. And there's a study here that I list at the bottom where this was demonstrated. So this is applied science. If you want to know what works best, you don't care about specific effects only. You care about the whole context of care delivery, so to speak. And so I think public health investigators need to more deliberately consider this distinction. There may be some public health investigators who, at least some of the time, are involved in theory testing, but I suspect that most people are involved more in applied testing of interventions than actually testing theories. So if you're in the realm of intervention testing versus theory testing in public health, there's this kind of a distinction that's not really a distinction, it's a continuum. We'll get to that, but it's efficacy versus effectiveness. And so in a nutshell, does the intervention do more harm than good when delivered under optimal circumstances? That's efficacy. Or does it do more harm than, or good than harm, when delivered under real world circumstances? That's effectiveness. But if you're talking about more good than harm, compared to what? If, in my opinion, you want to inform policy, the comparator needs to be clinically relevant, or at least those who are doing research that's not clinical, it has to be relevant from a healthcare delivery decision-making standpoint. And this is, again, evidence-based medicine requires medicine-based evidence. An efficacy trial is going to try to maximize internal validity. Effectiveness trial is going to maximize external validity. And they can differ in a lot of ways. How much control you have over the fidelity of the intervention, the kinds of participants who are enrolled into the study, whether or not the outcomes are kind of more near term or longer term, whether costs are, like in an efficacy trial, you spend a lot of money on the intervention. In the effectiveness trial, you don't, but you're more interested in understanding the costs, the cost benefits. So there are differences, but there's not necessarily a difference in the kind of control group that you would choose. typically. So as I said, efficacy and effectiveness exist along a continuum. And this is another kind of area of distinction that a lot of investigators don't consider as carefully as they might. I think that we've got limited human capital, limited time, limited money. We can't have a bunch of effectiveness trials before we get to, we can't be conducting a lot of efficacy trials unless it's absolutely necessary. We need to move towards effectiveness as soon as we can. And that means that when you're designing your randomized controlled trial, I think it's incumbent upon us to think about how far we can reasonably push the design toward effectiveness. We don't want to be efficacy all the way unless we have to be, because if you unnecessarily have too much of an efficacy focus, it just means that you're going to have to conduct more research before you get down the road toward effectiveness. It means that you need to recruit more participants into studies, means that you're putting more participants at risk because of extra research that's not necessarily required, and it's unethical. And we don't have time. We need to move forward as fast as we can. So I don't know if people know about the stage model, but it's different from, you know, phase 0 through phase 5 kind of drug trial, but it's similar in a lot of ways. And the reason why I point this out is they make a distinction between and I screwed up in my parenthetical there next to stage 2. It should say research setting, research-based kind of settings you may skip. Stage 2 is an efficacy trial that's conducted in a research setting. So you've got research interventionists, research staff, etc. Whereas a stage 3 efficacy trial is done in a community setting where you've got community interventionists, etc. A lot of people involved in community-based research will skip stage 2 because it's really not of interest. You usually don't need to demonstrate that you can conduct an intervention in a research setting with a lot of community-based research. And it's interesting because in stage 1, that's where you would create or adopt or refine your intervention and pilot test it. So in stage 1, if your next goal is to have a research setting-based efficacy trial, then your stage 1 activities would be focused on optimizing your design for that setting. But if you instead had a stage 1 activity where the next step was to go to a community setting for your trial, then your stage 1 activities would be optimized for that. So it's possible that you would go from stage 1 to stage 2. After stage 2 is completed, you would go back to stage 1 to refine your intervention for the community setting and then go to stage 3. So it's not a completely linear process. And the more you can, if you can skip stage 2, you're going to skip stage 2 and another stage 1. So it's all about thinking about how you can move forward as quickly as possible. Okay, so that's a lot of background. And I want to talk about some specific types of control groups. So these are the 3 I'm going to focus on most. There's some others that I'll mention. But the attention placebo control is like sham therapy. So this is pretty much coming from psychotherapy research. And the idea is that you're going to have this control group that's intervention that looks like real psychotherapy, that the patient thinks is real psychotherapy, but is completely inert when it comes to specific effects of that sham therapy on the outcome of interest. So say you've got psychotherapy for clinical depression, you've got some theoretically informed psychotherapy approach that is going to be tested, and the investigator wants to come up with a sham psychotherapy that looks like the participant, that it's actually valid psychotherapy to help reduce depressive symptoms, but actually has no active ingredients in it. It's the holy grail of psychotherapy research. I'm not sure it's attainable. It sounds like almost impossible when you're talking about behavioral interventions. If you're doing a procedural kind of thing like acupuncture, you could have sham acupuncture and the patient may not know it. But for something like kind of a talk intervention, I think it's pretty tough. But I do want to bring this up because I think it's important to understand where time and attention control came from. So I think a lot of people felt that attention placebo control and behavioral research really wasn't tenable. So they came up with a time and attention control. And I think the thinking was, well, I can't really have this kind of credible sham intervention, but at least I can control for the amount of time and attention that participants have to engage the intervention. And so you end up having interventions with really different content. So you've got like, your main interest is in sexual risk behavior reduction. So maybe you come up with a control group that's diet and exercise. So there's just as much kind of quantity of content and contact and kind of attention that has to be paid across these two sets of interventions, but they're really after different content. And then finally, usual care, sometimes referred to as unrestricted standard of care. Patients just, so you assign patients to get the experimental intervention or to basically get what they get in the wild. There's natural variation in usual care. It's not standardized. And it's important to note that it provides a solid kind of basis for understanding excess adverse events within the experimental condition, because usual care is kind of gives you a base rate for those kinds of things. Here are some other control group designs, which standard of care is basically protocolized standard of care, so it's like enforcing a certain standard instead of usual care, which could be variable. Waitlist control is sometimes used in communities where it's unacceptable to the community to just have a usual care kind of condition. So you're offering something to everyone, and that sometimes helps. And then there's dismantling controls where you have multiple experimental conditions and with different numbers and combinations of active ingredients in each of those. Talk about that. So again, going back to specific effects, non-specific effects, common effects, and total effects, I want to kind of do a conceptual decomposition of these three control group types, just to see what you might expect to get when you estimate your group difference at the end of the day. So for attention placebo control, it's kind of like a sham risk reduction intervention. Time and attention, it's going to be diet and exercise versus, say, a sex risk reduction intervention. And usual care is whatever participants access on their own outside of the study. So this is an attempt to kind of clarify, and you can tell me if it clarifies or confuses. But we've got a row for the intervention group, a row for the attention placebo control, and then we've got specific kinds of effects listed here. And so we've got this S int, that's the specific effect of the intervention of the sex risk reduction. So this is the theoretically indicated kind of effects that you would expect based upon mechanisms of action. The APC is a sham. So if you believe that APC is truly inert, then there won't be any specific effects of APC on sexual risk behavior. Now, if you believe that APC looks like a sex risk reduction intervention to the participants, and pretty much is delivered in a similar way, similar context as the actual experimental intervention, then you might be able to make an argument based upon assumptions that all of the non-specific effects of both interventions are common. So you've got time and attention, but you've got time and attention focused on content that is identical across the two interventions. It's about sex risk reduction. So if there's any non-specific effects across these two conditions, you might make an argument that they're common, that there are no non-common, non-specific effects. Untestable assumption. So if you believe all of that, then the total effect of the intervention group is going to be the specific effects plus the common effects, and the total effect of the APC is only going to be the common effects. Take the difference and you get what's in the yellow highlight there, the specific effects of the intervention. Sounds good. It's what you would want if you were testing theory, because what you really want is an estimate of the specific effects of your theory. If there's no specific effects of your theory that are detectable, then there's probably something wrong with your theory. But this is the ideal outcome, and I just think that it's kind of implausible. There's a lot of untested assumptions here, and many have argued that it's kind of unattainable, just conceptually in behavioral research. But I think it's a good introduction to all of this. So moving to the time and attention control, so here we have a sex risk behavior intervention and a lifestyle intervention that's supposed to be matched on amount of time and attention. On the top panel, we've got the ideal outcome, which is just like it was for APC. But there's a lot of untested assumptions, and there's a lot of reasons to suspect that that won't bear out. So looking at the next panel, if your lifestyle, if you've got this lifestyle intervention, then you could probably make a pretty good argument that there's no specific effects of your lifestyle intervention on sexual risk behavior. So I think, I'm going to buy that one. But then you move over to the non-specific effects. And I think it's really difficult to make the case that there would be common effects in this case, because you can match on time and attention, but time and attention within the context of a sex risk reduction intervention is plausibly related to sex risk behavior if the intervention is effective. Time and attention in the context of a lifestyle intervention, I can't figure out how it's going to be positively related to sexual risk reduction. It just doesn't make sense. Now, it could be that time and attention in the lifestyle intervention is negatively related to the outcome because you're distracting participants away from potentially thinking about their sex risk and making them think instead about diet and exercise. So it's possible that you end up having competing demands, and that not only, it's possible that time and attention is a positive influence within sex risk or zero influence in lifestyle, but it's also possible that it's a negative influence in lifestyle. And there's plenty of studies that have shown this. Well, there's several. Some studies have had active intervention, time and attention control, and then unusual care. And there's several examples where the time and attention control does worse than usual care. And so there's a real possibility that this distraction effect is happening. So I think that this bottom panel is much more plausible than the top panel. The yellow highlight shows the nature of the effect estimate that you would get when you compare groups on the outcome at the end of the day. And if there is a negative effect of specific effects in the time and attention control, then you're going to overestimate your treatment effect. But more importantly, in my opinion, you're comparing an experimental intervention versus a lifestyle intervention. I mean, sex risk versus diet and exercise. Who cares about that distinction? Someone might, but most people who might be making a policy decision about whether to implement your sex risk reduction intervention, they're not going to be interested in that comparison. I would think they would want to know, how does the experimental intervention compare to what is kind of commonly available, not pitting two disparate active interventions against each other. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that there were no specific effects of the time and attention control intervention. Then what you would get, it would be a better result for sure. And what you would get is basically the total effect in the intervention group. That's a useful quantity to know, but you don't know if that's what you're going to get without making some assumptions. And I also want to point out that when the investigator decided to use the time and attention control, what they were really trying to get at was the specific effects of their intervention. What they're getting is the total effects. So they're not getting what they asked for. So they went to a lot of trouble, spent more money on building a lifestyle intervention, and they're not getting what they set out to get.
Would it be closer on this continuum to effectiveness?
Yes.
Still be worthwhile?
It might still be worthwhile, but again, it rests on untestable assumptions, because I think this is a possible outcome. I think the second panel here is at least equally plausible, and maybe more plausible, depending upon the nature of the interventions that you're talking about, just because of the distraction factor. So so this is an example, I'll just jump ahead, where time and attention control is clearly contraindicated. So I've been involved in some implementation science projects where you're basically trying to, there's a lot of evidence-based medicine that there's no time to fit into a regular kind of doctor visit, primary care visit. And so you're always looking for ways to allow doctors to kind of get to some of the, like smoking cessation or breast cancer screening discussions with their patients. And so one idea is patients in the waiting room and they fill out some questions on a tablet, and then it kind of calculates a risk score and it makes some kind of recommendations. You get a printout before the visit, patient has a printout, doctor has a printout, and the doctor can use this to talk with the patient in a more efficient manner about their risk reduction or any kind of tests they might need, or going to talk to the genetic counselor. Some people have proposed, well, in this context, we need a time and attention control. And I said, well, no, you absolutely do not want a time and attention control, because if you randomize patients to have, say, breast cancer risk reduction on the tablet with a queuing sheet, go talk with your doctor, you're trying to promote breast cancer related discussion with the doctor. If the other patients who are assigned to the control get exercise, then what are they going to do? They're going to go in the visit, they're going to talk with their doctor about exercise. That's going to distract them from talking about breast cancer screening. So you're stacking the deck against, you know, your outcome of interest. And I mean, it's really clear here that you're stacking the deck and you're going to overestimate the effect of your experimental intervention. But in some other cases, it might not be as clear. But that's one example. So going back to the decomposition, now we've talked about attention placebo control and time and attention control. So this is usual care. So usual care, hopefully usual care is going to have some, you know, if usual care is more than do nothing, there's going to be some specific effects of usual care, some specific effects of your experimental intervention. There's going to be some non-specific effects of both as well. And you kind of like add them all up and subtract them from each other, and what you get is the total effect of the experimental intervention versus usual care. Now, it looks messy, but it is a relevant estimate of intervention effect because UC is relevant. Now, previously we were talking about time and attention control, diet and exercise. Is that relevant for making a policy decision about the experimental intervention? Probably not for most people. In this case, usual care is directly relevant. Now, usual care varies from location to location and even within a study. But if the usual care in the study approximates reasonably what the policymaker is looking at in terms of their usual care, it's going to be informative. And none of this requires assumptions. There's about whether or not there are specific effects, whether or not there are non-specific effects, whether or not the non-specific effects are common effects. No assumptions. It's just, it is what it is. So, ethical considerations. We want to minimize human subjects' activity required to inform our policy decisions related to health care delivery. I think investigators need to carefully consider whether their study is theory testing or intervention testing. And part of that is trying to ask yourself which approach is more likely to maximize benefits and minimize harms to society. If you need to do theory testing, okay, but be deliberate about it. And if you really are going to invoke some kind of theory testing paradigm in a behavioral health intervention setting, you really have to ask yourself if you can design a control group that plausibly allows for the estimation of specific effects. If you're in the intervention testing realm, then you need to consider where you are on the efficacy effectiveness continuum. And I think you should try to move yourself as far toward effectiveness as you can, as is appropriate at that time, and choose a control group that will best inform policy decisions. I'm not going to read them all, but you know, as I said before, usual care also provides a basis for safety monitoring, because if you have, say, I mean, you could have some kind of comparison group that wouldn't really give you an understanding of what the adverse event base rate is. So your DSMB, when they're looking at your adverse event rate in a study without usual care, they're not going to have a good idea of whether or not your adverse event rate represents excess risk. It may not be a big deal for a lot of behavioral interventions that are kind of low risk studies, but it is something to consider. Some people have argued that because usual care is not always up to the standard of care, that it's unethical. I don't buy that argument. I think it's probably the case that in a true effectiveness trial, it's always usual care that's the comparator. And so it's not unethical there. Why would it be unethical if you're closer to efficacy? The bottom line is you're trying to inform policy decisions, and if your ethical viewpoint forces you to only conduct kind of irrelevant research, then that's unethical because you're putting subjects at risk without getting to the end game. And you know, I think there's a lot of kvetching out there about wanting to know specific effects. I think advocates of time and attention control think they might be getting at specific effects, think that specific effects are the only game in town. I don't think that's right. I think total effects are important to know. So, proposal strategies. You write in your proposal and you say you're going to use usual care, and you get some reviewer who says, no, you can't do that. Happens a lot. Many reviewers will insist that you have time and attention control. This leads some investigators to always propose time and attention control. And those kind of reviewers, they don't seem to get much resistance from other reviewers in discussion. So if you're going to propose usual care, you need to make a strong case for it. You don't just say we're going to have usual care. You need to explain why you're going to have usual care. You're essentially giving the committee members who are sympathetic with you ammunition that they can use in the discussion of your proposal. If you can plausibly claim that yours is an effectiveness trial, then I don't think anyone has a problem with usual care. But I got to point out that it's strange to me that if usual care is okay for effectiveness, why isn't it okay for efficacy? Doesn't make any sense. If you can argue that your primary goal is to inform health policy, and that understanding the total effect is what you really need to understand, that might help. But that's a tough sell. If you can argue that time and attention control would stack the deck, and perhaps overestimate the intervention effect, I think that would help. Or if you can argue that TAC is or that UC is needed for safety monitoring, I think that helps as well. Not guaranteed. This is churchy, as I say. It seems to be tribal, and it's hard to, in the context of a proposal where the investigators have very little recourse, it's kind of dangerous territory. But if you want to be absolutely safe, at this point in time, you can propose time and attention matching.
So another argument against TAC is where's equipoise at trying to randomize participants? There's no proposed benefit coming from the TAC control.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right.
Maybe one more bullet in your...
No, you're absolutely right. It's funny because I was going to talk about equipoise in this, but I had never considered that angle on it. That's very good. Thank you. So with manuscripts, it's kind of a different story because you've got lots more power in that situation. Occasionally, reviewers complain that it should have been time and attention matching, but it's easy enough to write up a response negating that critique, I think. And really, at the end of the day, all you really need to do is convince the editor, because they will shut down the reviewer if they need to. So here's just the summary of what's the difference between theory testing and intervention testing. One thing is that I didn't mention is that theory testing really tries to get at mechanisms of action through specific effects. So it's really trying to design the study to detect mechanisms of action with the group comparison, whereas in intervention testing, you're going to be relying on mediation analysis. So that's the end of that one. I hope it was clear. I think I took longer on that one than I wanted to. But any other questions?
How do you see most designs fitting into this?
Oh, wow. Haven't even thought about that.
Because I mean, those purport to get at mechanisms of action, but in a very, internally valid kind of way.
Right.
With factorial, fractional factorial.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot you can do if you're going to have a more elaborate design with more conditions. You can really kind of try to decompose things. But, in my opinion, most of the kind of RCTs that we propose are these like 5-year, 500 to 1,500 people, kind of, at least a year of follow-up, if not longer. And just having kind of more expensive, elaborate kind of designs that are really, you're trying to detect pretty small effect sizes and things like that. It's kind of problematic. So I just punt on that one, and I don't know if it's. I mean, I'm sure there's like micro randomized trials and things like that too. So this is a very simple take on the old school, intervention versus control kind of design. But interesting. I'll think about that.
So it seems like there's a package. Like if you're gonna do this, create your stages, but if you're gonna do a really, you feel like you have to do a tightly controlled trial, it seems like that's when you're gonna most likely to get at the specific effects. And it's sort of like you go together. But if you're gonna say, no, we're not gonna do this, we're gonna go in the real world, and you're gonna get the internal validity and maybe the repeatability that the NIH is going after. If you say you're gonna do a pragmatic trial, then where you're not going after specific effects. It feels like two different things, and maybe your point. My take-home message is maybe you have to be really clear on which one you're doing and why. But if I were to do a tightly controlled trial and then have a usual care arm, it doesn't seem to match up.
Well, okay, so think of 3 distinctions: theory testing, pure efficacy, and pure effectiveness.
Yeah, I'm putting efficacy and theory together. Maybe.
Well, there's a whole kind of theory of mine. There was this 1967 article that basically was before people were talking about efficacy versus effectiveness, but and what the authors, Schwartz and somebody, what the authors were talking about was explanatory versus pragmatic. Careful reading. Their explanatory is sometimes theory testing, and it's sometimes efficacy. Their pragmatic is anything on the efficacy effectiveness continuum, but probably more toward effectiveness. So there's been some confusion on the use of the explanatory and pragmatic labels, because they've kind of been, some people just kind of map them directly onto efficacy effectiveness, and that's not quite right. But if you make a distinction between theory testing, pure efficacy, and pure effectiveness, then a pure efficacy trial is just as tightly controlled as a theory testing trial. You're going to have to spend lots of money making sure that your intervention is delivered with high fidelity. You're going to be tracking down your participants like crazy to make sure you don't, lose them to attrition. There's going to be lots of monitoring of all the activities, etc. So I don't think that I'm not going to go along with the fact that that a pure efficacy trial is looser or less controlled than a theory testing trial.
I don't think I
it would be the
was
same.
saying that. I was like putting them together in a bucket, because why would you do efficacy without the tight control. You would, right?
Well, you would, if it was pure efficacy, it would be really tight control. But it's the choice of the control group that distinguishes between theory testing and efficacy, and it not the tightness.
Right. They just seem so linked to me. Like.
Right, and see, this is what I'm saying.
But I realize they're
investigators need to kind of be more deliberate and separate those things out, because there's been a blurring. And the blurring has kind of, what's won the day is you should have a time and attention match control because of this blurring. And people haven't thought it through enough. We need to raise the debate. So I'm behind, so I'm going to try to move fast. So I don't like making adjustments for multiple testing in the context of scientific RCTs, and usually it's not a problem, but occasionally you get some blowback from somebody about this. There's an ongoing debate about whether null hypothesis and significance tests are even of value in science. And the debate ebbs and flows. It was like overflowing about 20 years ago, died down a little bit, I think. And I'm not going to get into that, but I think that most journal editors and reviewers still expect to see p-values when you're publishing the results of your RCT. So talking about p-values. So I think everyone probably knows what the multiple testing problem is. The investigator sets an alpha level. It's the probability of making a type 1 error. So as an example, say you have 20 tests, each at 0.05, then if you assume that the null hypothesis is true for each test and that each test is independent, then you might expect one type 1 error just by chance from that set of 20 tests. And this kind of makes some people very nervous because you might be accepting the alternative hypothesis when you should not be. So there's lots of schemes. I mean, this is like there's a cottage industry out there for different ways to adjust your alpha. So if you had 20 tests, you could just do a simple adjustment, divide your alpha by 20, and you get 0.0025. And then obviously there's going to be implications for your sample size calculation. So in this example, with no adjustment, it's 491 per group. With adjustment for 20 tests, it ends up being 934 per group, a 90% increase. Or alternatively, if you just had 5 tests, 730 per group, it's about a 50% increase over 491. So it's a big deal. You are, not only is it more expensive, but ethically you have to ask yourself whether or not you need to put the additional participants at risk and slow down the rest of science for your study. Because there's only so many participants you can study. But in public health, the multiple testing is not at all a universal concern. It does come up from time to time, and usually when someone pulls that card out, they kind of command all the attention. There's not a lot of people who are ready to argue them down. It's kind of like the time and attention control card that someone pulls out, and other reviewers in the panel don't want to say anything against it because it's too long of a discussion. I mean, it took me an hour, right? So, but it's usually raised in the context of RCTs and definitely in large-scale multiple testing. So, genome-wide association studies, it definitely comes up. I've rarely seen anyone ask for adjustments to the alpha for like regression models fit to observational data. So what are the different contexts? Multiple outcomes. So you've got an RCT proposing to test intervention effects on multiple outcomes. So that's one form of multiple testing situation. You can have an RCT with more than 2 experimental groups and with more than number of groups minus 1 comparisons. So say you've got 2 active interventions, A and B, and 1 control, and you say you're going to perform all 3 pairwise comparisons between those confidence groups. You got 3 groups, 2 degrees of freedom on that categorical variable, but you want 3 tests. This is what I was taught in graduate school. That's multiple testing, the middle one. I have textbooks where they claim that if you have 2 or more groups and you really only want to do G-1 comparisons, so you've got A, B, and C, and you just want to compare A to the control and B to the control, I have textbooks that say that's multiple testing. Yeah, I mean, it's perverse. It's just completely perverse. It makes no sense at all. If you ran 2 different studies, then you would have to collect, double the number of control group participants. And yes, you could kind of make some claims to scientific rigor, but it just doesn't make sense to me. But I'm going to focus on the multiple outcomes, because for me, that's the most common thing. And this is just an example study that I was involved in. It's called Community of Voices. Julie Johnson is here at UCSF in the School of Nursing, and it was her study. Got a perfect score on its 1 point, perfect NIH review score.
Wow.
10.
First submission?
First submission.
Whoa.
And the reason why is because the intervention is you go to senior centers and you start choirs, and people get to sing in choirs. And choirs really potentially have a lot of health benefits. They're cheap, they're sustainable, and not everyone, but plenty of people at senior centers are like just crawling over each other to get into the choir. It's really a high value thing. So it's not like, oh, come to the exercise class. It's like, come to choir. And everyone's like, yeah, I want to go to choir. So the reviewers loved it so much. The proposal didn't even have a pilot study or anything to support it. And they gave it a perfect score. It's like, yeah, you guys were looking the other way on this one because they liked the idea so much. But it's multimodal. There's a lot of things that can happen, a lot of benefits. You have to remember the words. You have to time yourself with the other parts of the choir. You have to stand up and kind of engage your core and breath control and balance. And loneliness among seniors is a huge, huge issue.
You have to be able to sing.
Well,
about the words.
You have to not care or sing or something. I'm sure there's plenty of people who are singing that out of key. But if you're having fun, that's what it's all about. So there's going to be multiple outcomes. There's going to be some cognitive outcomes. There's going to be some social outcomes, some physical health outcomes. So we're in a multiple testing situation right off the bat. So my argument is that against adjustment for multiple comparison is that in the context of a scientific randomized controlled trial, you got a limited set of interrelated but hypotheses for each, and you're going to be transparent and honest in your reporting of results. And the arguments in favor of adjustments for multiple testing stem from kind of a Neyman Pearson inductive behavior perspective on the role of statistics in science. That's really, a lot of people believe, is better suited for statistical process control than it is for scientific RCTs. And that adjustments for like multiple testing in the multiple outcome realm presume this kind of universal null hypothesis that you're kind of trying to control for type 1 errors across a whole set of outcomes simultaneously. Here we go. So I don't know how much people know, but Fisher and Neyman, and it's Pearson, not Person, we're in a highly acrimonious debate for decades because they did not see eye to eye philosophically about the role of statistics in science. And really it was like a 50-year knock down, drag out in the literature. It's crazy. And the thing is that what we understand as frequentist statistics is this kind of like a hybrid between Fisher and Neyman Pearson, and like no one has claimed responsibility for being the one who did the hybridization. The theory is that it was the early textbook writers who audiences, because they didn't even include references in the textbook because they figured the psychologists would never understand. Couldn't read the mathematical, journal articles, and so the authors just kind of wrote these big giant texts with no references, and they kind of morphed together these two perspectives into something that neither Fisher nor Neyman and Pearson would agree with. So once again, some kind of misunderstanding that's playing out over the course of decades and decades. Really about decision making in repeated testing situations. So like quality control. You've got a production line, you're going to sample widgets off the production line, you're going to see what the kind of error rate is in the widgets, what kind of quality deficits, and you're going to decide whether or not it's just kind of like a few random messed up widgets or whether there's an actual production problem. And if there's an actual production problem, you better halt the line and take remedial action. But and you're going to be doing this quality control all the time. It's a continuous thing. So you really do have this kind of repeat experiment, so to speak. And so your alpha is a long-run probability of making a type 1 error, such as halting the production line when there's no production problem. And so the Neyman Pearson their perspective is really focused on decisions acting upon the evidence. So you're either going to choose the null or you're going to choose the alternative. It's not about inference or generalizing from the experiment to the world. I see Mike's nodding, which gives me a lot of satisfaction because he's our historian of statistics. To Neyman and Pearson, the exact p-values aren't really of interest. What's of interest is whether or not they're above or below alpha. So if you say alpha equals 0.05 and you have your experiment and get p equal 0.04, to them that's the same as p equals 0.0001. Fisher would say, no, that's not right because strength of evidence, smaller p is stronger evidence. And this is like one of the things that they probably argued about over 25 articles. And then, in Neyman Pearson, there's this whole idea that experiments will be repeated numerous times, each drawing from the identical population. And a lot of people have questioned the relevance of this for behavioral research because replication is rare. And then there's this whole idea of what's the identical population? Like, show me you're really tapping into the identical population. Can you even define the population when you're talking about humans? With widgets, yes. Humans, maybe not. And Fisher just regarded Neyman Pearson as non-scientific because it was too kind of decision-based and not inference-based. So if you go with this kind of adjustment for multiple testing, it's more in the Neyman Pearson realm, and you invoke this kind of null hypothesis that holds for all of the multiple outcomes simultaneously. But the problem for me is that as a scientist, I don't know, there's a policymaker out there in the future. I don't know who the policymaker is. I don't know what their decision space is going to be. And in my community of voices example, there might be a policymaker who's interested in cognitive, physical, and emotional outcomes. There could be a policymaker who's really mostly interested in the mental health kind of benefits of the intervention. And I don't know what choice they're going to make in terms of what they're going to focus on. And so this whole idea of having a universal null just doesn't really seem to be the right choice when you're trying to inform policy decisions who will be made by others. That will be made by others. So many have argued that this universal null is just not a good choice for scientific randomized controlled trials. And so anytime you can quote D.R. Cox in your defense, you should do it. So I have done that here, and that's about the pithiest quote I could find, which is kind of, it's relevant to the nature of this problem because it's not, you can't have these little kind of pithy statements about why you disagree with one position or another. But the idea is to conduct marginal tests, make marginal inferences, and have a test-wise error rate of p is less than 0.05. You know, actually it should be alpha equals 0.05. I made the mistake that I was trying to avoid there. Equating p and alpha, two totally different things. Assure that these statistical tests are a tool for inductive inference, and that marginal p-values represent the strength of evidence against individual null hypotheses. So there's still room for disagreement on this, but that's my perspective on it. So adjustments for multiple testing, sure, in large-scale multiple testing, kind of GWAS type studies. These are like highly mechanical searches for associations without the opportunity for some kind of rapid replication, not very theory-informed. If you're looking at associations between hundreds of SNPs and some form of cancer, you're just searching. Probably there's a lot of null-ish relationships in your data. And if you do hundreds and hundreds of tests, then yeah, you're going to expect a large number of false discoveries. And so you may want to be a little bit more diligent in that case. Some examples below, I mean, some of these, besides GWAS, you end up, you get it into some ridiculous stuff where people are looking at, like the Bible code, looking for patterns of words in the Bible that will predict future events, stuff like that. Like you can make that happen easily if you look hard enough.
That's in the original language or in translation?
Well, it's true. It started out with Hebrew, but someone was able to apply the same kind of methodology to some Supreme Court decision. So it's really not relevant to any version of the Bible either. I mean, you could deal yourself 5 cards, and eventually you're going to get a royal flush. Say it's magical. So for peer-reviewed journals, so in my 20 large-scale RCTs, I've had 2 sets of critique come back, insisting adjustment for multiple testing of multiple outcomes. One was the COV, the Community of Voices intervention, and the other was a multimodal lifestyle intervention to reduce diabetes risk reduction, or reduce diabetes risk, excuse me. And in both cases, I wrote a response. It was an essay. It was like a page and a half, just saying, nope, we reject this, and prevailed. I mean, I used to think it was just an insurmountable thing to like tell a reviewer no to this request. But one of my investigators asked me if I would try. So I started looking at the literature and I said, well, actually, there's a lot of support for this point of view that you don't need to adjust. So I did, and a lot of the points I've made already were included, and I'm not going to read these quotes, but if you get the slide, you can see the quotes. So there's this long quote here that I include. And there's another pretty long quote, and here's like 4 here's 4 articles that are worth taking a look at if you ever want to read up on this issue. So for the first one, this was the community of voices. We're still resubmitting the final version, but the reviewer who requested adjustment for multiple testing was completely satisfied. Didn't say anything, so thank you very much. The editor said he was not convinced, but agreed to let us publish without adjusting for multiple testing anyway. And he asked that we distill our argument into a few sentences. So this is what I drafted. Again, I'm not going to read it now. You can look at it. It could be improved, I'm sure. The other article was the HAPH. It was a reviewer who said we needed to adjust for multiple testing, and the editor just accepted our argument and didn't send out the paper for second review. So I think there's some support out there for this idea that you don't have to adjust for this. But for proposals, it's a different story. Again, the tyranny of the peer reviewer can be an issue. So with a multimodal intervention, my take is that proposal reviewers are usually okay with selection of a single primary outcome per kind of mode. I think that works pretty well. You could just pick one single outcome, but if you've really been selling this as a multimodal intervention, that's probably disingenuous. For designs with more than 2 intervention groups, I think if you just propose that you're going to have more than groups minus 1 number of comparisons, you probably better adjust for multiple comparisons. If your number of comparisons equals the number of groups minus 1, then probably you're going to be okay without an adjustment. But what I usually do in that case is I say we're gonna test 2 orthogonal contrasts, 2 planned comparisons, and saying that they're orthogonal just kind of, I don't know, it's kind of a magic word, right? So it kind of seems to have always carried the day. So let's say you have A and B or both active interventions and a control. What you can propose to do is you're gonna compare A versus B, and then you're gonna combine A and B and compare them to the control. And then what you do is you power for the comparison between A and B, and then by the time you lump those together, the control group is going to be like this tiny set of people, like, you know, maybe like 100 probably is going to do it if you're talking about a study that's got 700 people. So ethical considerations. If you agree that theory-based interventions with hypothesized outcomes do not require adjustment for multiple outcome testing, then if you do adjust for multiple testing, it's unethical because you're going to end up recruiting too many participants for your study. So, you know, our data analysis in health research is really highly ritualized. It's, you know, there's a process. You collect your data, you fit your model, you get a p-value. You know, if it's significant, you report it and kind of do this procedure. And it's not a good thing to have such ritualized activity because you don't think as much. You just have to follow the guidelines, stay in between rails, so to speak. And, you know, but those, and adjustment for multiple testing isn't really a universal part of this ritual, but those who insist that it should be are even adding to the ritual. It's really being highly prescriptive. And to me, it implies that consumers can't be trusted to exercise critical judgment, or that scientists aren't trustworthy. And so, they don't know enough to be left to their own devices. So we need kind of prescriptive rituals to keep them in line. And I would just reject this kind of thinking. I think we need to use our brains.
Steve, do you have the same argument if you have multiple measurements of the same dimension, like 3 anxiety scores?
Well, I think what's going to happen is that if you're probably going to pick one of them as your primary, and if they really are highly redundant, then I would probably stick with that. But if they're really distinct in some way, then you argue that they're distinct and they uniquely contribute to the information from the scientific information from the trial that can be used to inform decisions later.
Well, not to mention, you would have had to justify why you got the redundant, why you got three measures. Usually there's some circumstance under which they operate differently, so you have, under those circumstances, different. Otherwise, they usually wouldn't do it with each one. So you have a primary.
So the bottom line also is that if you're transparent in your reporting, and if any reader wants to apply the adjustments, they can do it very easily. I mean, the counter argument is if you applied the adjustments, the reader could unapply them just as easily. So depending on your orientation about what you think is ethical with respect to the sample size that you need to collect, people can apply or unapply your adjustments. So it's not as if it's all kind of a black box that you can't unpack at the end of the day. So that's the end of part 2. And we're doing pretty good because I think we have about 40 minutes left for the last topic. Okay, are we ready to go? Okay. So, purpose and design of pilot RCTs. More controversy. So, we all know that RCTs are the gold standard for research design in medical sciences, and there's lots of guidance on the role, design, conduct, reporting of full-scale RCTs. There's more books than you can count. There's like Helsinki Declaration, there's consort guidelines, and it just goes on and on and on. But when it comes to pilot RCTs, there's no similar guidance about what they should be. And essentially, kind of organically, there's a traditional perspective, the traditional NIH reviewer perspective, and an alternative perspective. And when you're writing proposals, it's good to be aware of both, and because you're going to need to make your case. So the traditional perspective, so how big should a pilot trial be? Well, if it's too big, then reviewers will tell you it's a definitive trial. And if it's too small, they'll say, well, it's kind of irrelevant. And you just had to like thread some kind of a line between this Goldilocksian kind of world. And usually what people ended up with, in my experience, is that less than 100, but more than 60. And so you just kind of like, we're in there somewhere. And this was largely to make sure that it was not considered too small and not considered a definitive trial. Because if you said my pilot sample's going to be 150 people, a reviewer for sure is going to say it's a definitive trial. And you wouldn't get funded.
When you're saying those numbers, like 50, are you taking into account that you might be randomizing to 2 different conditions?
Right. I'm pretty much assuming just a 2-condition thing, but 50 per group.
Okay.
or, so that the whole trial would be less than 100, not 100 per group. And so traditionally, mostly I think what people focused on is, well, logistically, that they could recruit, that they could randomize, and that they could retain. And a lot of times people didn't focus on things like intervention fidelity or participant adherence or burden of assessments in their proposals. It's more like recruitment, the 3 R's: recruitment, randomization, retention, and then statistics. You wanted to obtain an effect size estimate that you would use to inform the power analysis for your subsequent full-scale RCT. And to some extent, people might talk about preliminary evidence of efficacy. In the alternative perspective, the statistical aspects of this have been removed, and there's more emphasis on all of the logistical aspects, so that you're really going to be talking about fidelity monitoring during your pilot trial, and you're going to have a definition of participant adherence to the intervention, and you're going to be looking at that. And so in the alternative perspective, it's all about logistics. So the quote is, it's about, our pilot RCTs are about logistics, not statistics. And really what, like, if you have a full-scale RCT, it might be stopped because you might have like interim testing. So it might be stopped because of statistical futility. Might be stopped because your interim results suggest efficacy, and it's time to stop because you don't need to go further. It could be stopped for safety reasons, but it also could be stopped for what's called logistical futility. So the inability to recruit, the inability to randomize, the inability to retain, the inability to assess, something that is so egregious that it's like, you can't even do this. I mean, it's time to stop. That's logistical futility, and the idea behind an alternative perspective on pilot RCTs is to provide evidence that a full-scale RCT is unlikely to fail because of logistic futility. So why should we avoid obtaining effect size estimates? Low precision, fallible decision-making, and equipoise ethics are the three. So most people agree that pilot RCTs are underpowered for tests of group difference. However, NH reviewers in the traditional perspective still want effect size estimate for pilot RCTs, but an underpowered study yields unreliable effect size estimates. An underpowered study is not going to have a lot of precision for effect size estimates. So here's an example. Say you have 2-group pilot RCT, 40 per group, 80% retention, end up with N32 per group at the end of the day. Your expected widths of your 95% confidence interval for a group difference, treatment versus control, for a continuous outcome, the width is 1 standard deviation. That's larger than a large effect size. That's huge. With a binary Y, say if the true prevalence is 50% in both groups, and you assume that, say, then the 95% CI covers intervention group prevalence estimates from 25% to 75%. So you're talking about a span of, huge odds ratios. So this is kind of like all you need to know. Unless you're willing to have pilot studies that are much larger, this is all you need to know about why you don't try to get effect size estimates from pilot studies. But Helena Kramer, and somehow I missed mentioning her paper before. Oh, here it is, a tiny tiny font at the bottom. This is the seminal article that basically came out and questioned all of this kind of effect size estimation from pilot studies business in 2006. And really, like, every statistician knew that pilot studies were too small to get good effect size estimates, but everyone also understood that NIH review panels expected that those effect size estimates would be part of the proposal. So we were glad to see that article come out to kind of bring some light of the day to it. So why would you avoid obtaining effect size estimates from pilot RCTs? One is low power, or low precision, excuse me. The other one is fallible decision making. And so this is like where the Kramer article took it a step further. It's very interesting because your pilot study is small, your confidence intervals for your effect size estimates are wide, so it's really possible that you're going to have over or under estimates. And so if your pilot study overestimates the true effect size, then you're going to be emboldened. You're going to assume this larger effect size. You're going to conduct a power analysis for your full-scale RCT. You're going to get a too small sample as a result because you're having a big effect means smaller sample required. And then you're going to have a full-scale RCT that's underpowered. Or, on the other hand, if your pilot study underestimates the effect size, you're going to be disappointed. And you're going to say, oh, I don't have any preliminary evidence of efficacy, and so now I'm not even going to embark on the full-scale RCT. So you end up with this kind of worst of all worlds, full-scale RCTs that go into production that are underpowered and potentially some good ideas that never. Want the pilot studies to show preliminary evidence of efficacy, so they show promise. And that goes against the concept of equipoise. And so I stole this slide from Ken Friedland, who's got this amazing slide set about pilot studies. And so this is the link to his slide set that you can get. It's really good, but this one just kills me, because it's so right on. You know, the zone of equipoise is where you should be before you start a full-scale RCT. But what reviewers want you to be is in the zone of enthusiasm. and by kind of demanding that pilot studies produce an effect size estimate, or that they produce some preliminary evidence of efficacy, it completely flies in the face of equipoise. I mean, it's just, if you think about it, it's a completely unethical position. It's like, I never thought about it that way, but I was like, you're right. Absolutely right. So just to summarize, the risks of getting effect size estimates from pilot RCT: unreliable effect sizes, full-scale RCTs that are conducted but underpowered or abandoned, and full-scale RCTs that lack equipoise, or at least on the face of the evidence from your unreliable effect size estimates may lack equipoise. But the goal instead is acceptability and feasibility. So it's not about whether the full-scale RCT had a good chance of showing a significant outcome, and it's not about efficacy, effectiveness, or safety. Pilot studies are too small to assess safety, but rather whether or not your full RCT will provide a reasonable test of the intervention, a fair test. So when I'm writing proposals, I make sure that I make the case for the fact that we are not going after effect size estimates in this pilot study. So I say something like in the blue text. It wasn't until this year that I adopted this approach. Prior to this year, I was still proposing pilot studies that would estimate effect size estimates because I figured that there's a better chance that reviewers were going to side with that position than with the alternative position. So that reviewers are expecting effect size estimates, so give it to them. But I learned earlier this year that NCCIH has actually produced guidance on this. So they've got a whole website on pilot studies, common uses and misuses, and NCCIH is the only NIH institute that has decided that the debate is over on this and it's time to promote best practice. I have tried to get NIA to follow suit, and although they agree with what NCCIH has done, for some reason they are still letting the scientific community debate this issue. And there's kind of like no debate. But the fact that NCCIH, I wish it was NCI, would be more influential than NCCIH, but the fact that you can point to NIH guidance in a proposal about this was what made me decide that it was time to switch over. And also I know a lot of reviewers, NIH reviewers, who always tell me, at the beginning of every proposal review session, I remind everyone that pilot studies are too small. Although there's lots of reviewers out there who are spreading the word on this. But these two papers are the Kramer paper and the NCCIH guidance is what I would, at least, there are other papers, but I would cite those in a proposal. And then what you want to do is you kind of list all of your feasibility and acceptability outcomes for the pilot. So you kind of have a table or something like this where you talk about screening and recruitment and randomization, fidelity, and adherence, retention, etc. And you give thresholds for each of these that you're going to use. And then your analysis plan. And this is new, so this is going to change, but right now what I'm doing is descriptive analysis, just descriptive. What's happening that's really annoying is that some reviewers are saying things like, yeah, we get that you can't get effect size estimates, and yes, we understand that you don't have power to detect group differences, but I want to see confidence intervals around your feasibility and acceptability thresholds. It's like, what are you talking about? That makes no sense, because if I don't have reliable or sufficient precision around an effect estimate, I don't have sufficient precision around acceptability or feasibility threshold value. So that is something that also needs to be addressed head on in the proposal, because I've just got a review back where a reviewer said that, made that comment. It didn't make it up to the summary discussion, so might have been shot down in discussion. But I also know one NIH reviewer who says that her committee always expects to see confidence intervals around these threshold values. And I just told her that shouldn't happen.
Lack of understanding of the meaning.
The meaning of what?
Threshold? Or yes, wait.
Well, you either achieve it or you don't.
Oh yeah, right. But I mean, there might be some cases where you might look at a confidence interval in a pilot study, not for inference purposes, but just to kind of understand like how variable your recruitment might be across sites, or something like that in a more descriptive way.
I think the argument about the confidence interval for the feasibility is, I think it sounds, to me it sounds right, because if you don't really have enough sample size for a pilot study, then the accessibility or feasibility, the estimation of that is not really plausible, right? Even though I know this is pilot study, right?
Mhm.
But how can you judge, like, why do you need a 50? Why not 100? Why do you need 100, not 50? I think you still need, because this your primary endpoint for pilot study is the feasibility, right? So say the percentage of patients will return in the study, right? So if you only have like 10 patients, then then the retention rate is say 90%, then your confidence interval will be really wide, right? So I think that to me it's like provide a precision for the feasibility making sense. I agree with you for the efficacy, efficacy for the efficacy doesn't really make much sense here.
Well, I think that you're just moving. There's a problem of lack of precision for effect size estimates. There's going to be a similar problem of lack of precision for your feasibility and acceptability thresholds.
So you get double.
So it's just, I mean, you can get, I agree with you that what you're going to have to do as a pilot study investigator is make sure that you hit your thresholds, because that's what you're going for. And it's not, if you try to power or have a big enough sample in your pilot study so that you're going to have nice tight confidence intervals for your feasibility and acceptability outcomes, you're going to end up way beyond the pilot study size.
It depends on what is your feasibility. I mean, what is your lowest allowance feasibility threshold? Right. So, for example, if you expect your retention rate is 70%, right,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't want the retention rate as low as to 30%.
Right.
Right. So I think you want to have like a relatively large sample size. I mean, not really like that large, and then the lower confidence interval, lower bound of confidence interval is bigger than the 30%.
I think if you are going to propose a full-scale RCT and you're going to say in that you've got at least 70% retention, that you're going to need a pilot study that shows at least 70% retention. I think you just need to hit your marks. Otherwise, no one's going to have trust that you can do it. That's my take on it. So, yes. So, in my opinion, and this is all pretty new, and it's going to change with experience. But basically, you just make subjective judgment claims for sample size. Because if you get into precision, you're just back where you were before with effect sizes.
You're talking about just coming up with some rationale for your size.
You just say, I'm going to get 40 people per group. And I'm doing this because I think that's big enough. How else are you going to do it?
That's my question.
Yeah, no, that's how you do it. That's how you do it. I mean, I'm willing to learn otherwise, but the thing is, you make this big argument about why you're not going to be doing any kind of inferential statistics, and then you have to own that. You have to own it. You have to say, I'm not doing inferential statistics here. If you get back into the inferential statistics game, they're just going to drag you back in and say, well, why weren't you doing this for effect size estimates?
So how do you find effect size estimates? I wasn't planned to.
How to choose an effect size estimate. So the So what Helena Kramer et al. Said is you should really be looking at clinically important differences, sometimes called minimum clinically important differences, sometimes called clinically meaningful differences. And, you know, for a lot of our outcomes, we don't have those. And so if you are, say, proposing an R34, you might consider as part of your R34 activities having, you know, get some stakeholder, patient panels, et cetera, clinician panels, policy groups to help you define a clinically important difference. Something along those lines is probably something to consider. Of course, depending upon your review group, you might get away with benchmark thresholds, standardized effect sizes, you know, odds. If I can detect an odds ratio of 2, that's pretty good kind of arguments. I mean, I think you always need to show that the effect sizes that you can detect are going to be clinically meaningful, and that, you know, you don't want to have so much power that you're able to detect something so small that no one cares about. But you don't also want to have only the ability of detecting huge things. So I think it always plays a role, that's kind of clinical meaningfulness, always plays a role whether or not you have a definition of a clinically important difference. But, you know, your mileage may vary. Some review groups don't have a problem with standardized effect sizes. Some reject them. But I think part of your study planning in some circumstances is going to be creating a definition of a clinically important difference that you can, you know, obviously reviewers can argue against that, but if you have enough kind of stakeholders involved in that process. I've never done it. It's not an easy process. I think people have tried and been frustrated with it because people don't always agree. So it's new territory. So just some resources, papers to get. This bottom one is this Friedland slide set that I referred to before. It's really excellent. Here's some fidelity monitoring. I don't know how much people are into fidelity monitoring in their clinical trials. Linda Borelli is kind of the queen of that. And here are some publications for that. So that's the end.
More questions?
Could you go back to your pilot slide that had the checklist kind of a randomization, feasibility? So, yes, that one. I like to think about this as just making sure that, especially like you might have multiple centers, can all the centers achieve these benchmarks in a timely manner, or perhaps that if they cannot, that center should not be involved in the study going forward. So preliminary achievement challenges,
Right.
you know, to make sure that you're ready to roll. It's kind of a training period and evaluation.
Right.
So I don't see it statistically, like you, I don't
Right.
see it as a statistical exercise. I see it as screening of centers, screening of personnel and their readiness to engage in the RCT.
Yeah, I think the Friedland slide set talks a little bit about multi-center trials, and if I'm remembering correctly, it could have been some other article I read that, you know, does your pilot study really need to engage multiple centers, multiple sites, or can you get away with pilot study conducted in one site when you're having for an eventual multi-site trial? and it's, you know, I think it would help to have more than one site at least to be convincing, but it's definitely an extra wrinkle, and it may drop you out of R21 range for that kind of, you really get multi-site.
Or clusters at another level, like multiple PCPs or
Right.
other deliverers who might vary in their style and introduce,
Right.
you know, heterogeneity.
Yeah, it's a whole other kind of issue is like, okay, so I'm going to say that I can't estimate effect sizes, but am I going to say, can I estimate intra-provider correlation? Or, you know, and it's like, you probably shouldn't say that in a proposal because they'll shoot you down if you're saying I don't have precision here, but I'm going to use that point estimate there. But there is this whole question about when you're piloting or when you're trying to plan for your power analysis for full-scale RCT, you're probably going to need intercluster correlation estimates as well. And, but there you can make some conservative choices at least that, I mean, an intra-provider correlation of 0.10 is hugely conservative in most cases. So, but it is another issue. Turned everyone into a zombie.
I was on a study section where they shot down the time attention mesh control for your reasons. It was a few years ago even.
Wow,
Yeah, so,
I'd love to hear that.
yeah.
Steve, I would say it's more I've even incurred a sense of anxiety, at least in me, because I sit there and I think that, you know, so many of the panels reviewing R34s just have a fixed view of what you're supposed to do. Is that
Yep.
You're supposed to show evidence, preliminary evidence of efficacy. And then if you don't have that, you go on to an R01 and you don't have preliminary evidence of efficacy, they won't fund you because you don't have that. I mean, they're not, I agree with you, the idea about equipoise, you know, we ought to, that makes sense, but that's not how reviewers are doing it these days.
Yeah, and I think that's why like I said, I changed my tune when I saw the NCCIH guidance, because I can say this is NIH saying what research best practices are. And reviewers can disagree with that, and they can say, I don't care what NCCIH says, because I don't get funding from NCCIH. But it was enough to tip the scales for me. And plus, I know that more and more people are waking up to this Kramer article. And so I hear more and more just from my colleagues around campus that this issue has been discussed in their review committee. So I think it's rapidly changing review culture around this.
To go to the other direction, have you heard very often that proposals are nixed because they're proposing a definitive trial as a pilot?
Well, if you don't make it clear that your pilot is a pilot, reviewers will ding you for saying things like, it's not clear if this was supposed to be a definitive trial. Or some reviewers will think it's a definitive trial and others will think it's a pilot, either because they didn't read it carefully or because...
Well, I'm thinking like in an R34, and you have just so much power, you know, maybe you're doing 150 or something like that. Have you heard much that reviewers come back and say too much, too many people?
I think it's fairly common if you have a sample size, a total sample size of 150 in a pilot study, that you're going to have to really defend that as a pilot, like directly defend that as a pilot, because reviewers are likely to say that it's too big for a pilot, and they won't like that, for sure. And that's why this whole dance about, like, what's the sample size of in the traditional, it was kind of, on-the-job training, figuring out what reviewers thought a pilot study sample size should look like.
I mean, I've had it past where we had qualitative data that were very supportive of going forward. And that passed, but it was also based on previous studies that had shown it, this particular intervention to work. So I'm not sure I would suggest doing qualitative instead of some quantitative, at least at an R34 stage.
Well, you need to have some quantitative just to show feasibility. So you need to collect the measures. So what happens a lot of times is people think, well, you're collecting all the clinical endpoints in your pilot study. That must mean that what you're doing is going to have estimated effect size estimate. And so you just need to be really clear that the reason why you're collecting these measures is because of feasibility and acceptability. You need to have the same measurement protocol in your pilot study as you do in your main trial. Are the measures tolerable? Will people, complete them without complaining, etc. So yeah, that is another thing that comes up.
It's scary though. I think what Susan's saying though, that if they're gonna ask you for those data, and then if you don't have effect size that looks like it's towards that part of that grid, then they're gonna.
Isn't that a phase 2 trial?
Yeah,
I think that's a pilot. I think that's a phase 2.
you're gonna feel like the evidence, your scientific premise isn't there.
It does depend on your review group, because some review groups are really, they're like minimum clinically important difference. That's what I want to know. I don't care what your pilot study says or anything. I don't want, these empirically derived. I want clinically important differences, whereas others would be more inclined to want to know about pilot study, empirically derived effect size estimates. But I think when you go to your R01, you just need to explain that your pilot study came from the orientation of what the NIH is now pushing as best practices, and so your power is determined elsewhere. Your effect size is determined elsewhere. I mean, it's one of those areas where the culture is changing, and so knowing exactly what to do. I mean, we just got back a K. So one of my mentees got her K critiques back, and this is a resubmission. The original submission was last year, and we proposed to get effect size estimates from her pilot study. That was part of her K. And then the reviewers had a lot of kind of questions about the kind of pilot study procedures that were kind of hard to address. And at the same time, we got this NCCIH guidance. So we just decided for a resubmission to completely change gears, which is like, you never completely change gears unless the reviewers ask you to change gears. So, but we just decided, forget it. We're gonna cite NCCIH. We're gonna say, nope, before we were wrong. Now we're aware of this NIH guidance. We're gonna go for feasibility and acceptability, and the reviewers want it. I mean, they love that aspect of it. I don't know if it got a good score. We'll see if it gets funded, but I was really concerned about switching the kind of motivation for the pilot study in a resubmission, but on balance, it seemed like the right thing to do. And at the end of the day, because they were all happy with the effect size estimates to begin with. And then, but they were totally happy with the changes we made as well. So they bought it completely.
You'll be helping us, right?
Thank you.